It's a real pleasure to be here and to connect with all of you, at least in this way that we can connect virtually. I've been doing a lot of these virtual talks lately, and I love the fact that we can do this, have these discussions without having to travel all over the place. You know, limiting the amount of carbon pollution we're creating in the meantime. But of course, you know, it's hard to actually connect with any of you on the call. I never get to see most of you, and I don't know most of you. Liz has given me some background on at least where many of you are coming from, which institutions and agencies and things. But at the end of this presentation, I'm going to come back to a slide that looks like this, and it'll have this question: what are the greatest barriers to improving integrated fire, fish, and water management? And if you go to this webpage, pollev.com/PatrickBelmont912, you're going to be able to provide an answer to that question. And as the answers pop up, you can vote on different ones. So just have this question in the back of your head. I really do want to hear from you. I'd love for this to be the start of a conversation with many of you. I'm coming with my own perspective that's been developing over the past 15 years or so that I've been thinking about these issues. But there's a lot of other great knowledge on this call that I'd love to take more advantage of. Okay, so with that, let's move on. I just want to acknowledge my funding sources and lots of collaborators here that have made this research possible. This is really the group of people that I'm working most closely with. There's a broader group that I work with a little bit more broadly, but yeah, all these folks have contributed in substantial ways to the science that I'll talk about today. So this is how I'd like to spend the next about 40 minutes talking through the role of fire in Western ecosystems. And I suspect maybe changing some of your perspectives on the good, the bad, and the ugly about wildfire in the West. I'm going to spend maybe the bulk of time on the second point there, some of the science that we're doing, some of the new tools that we've developed to inform better forest fire and watershed management. I can't give a talk without talking at least very briefly about how these fire, fish, and water security problems are really intertwined within the broader issue of climate change and what we can do, what we need to be doing on that front. And then I'll end on a positive note. You know, next steps at the individual, state, and national scale. Some really positive things that I see and things that we could be doing a lot more of. So that's where we're heading here. Many of you are well aware that we have a lot of fires. This is our number of fires in the U.S. and the acres burned for the last couple of years. You know, we're getting up over 10 million acres burned for 3 of the last 7 years. This is just a plot of fires that occurred in 2021 that were over 100 acres of timber or 300 acres of grass or brush. We had a lot of fires. It's a big deal. There's a lot of press out there suggesting that we are setting records over and over again. And that's true if you just look back to 1984. That's when we started having satellite data that we could map these things with great precision. And this plot just shows the data from 1984 up through a partial year of 2015. 2015 ended up being somewhere up here. And so, you know, if you look at just that time period, yes, we do keep setting records every couple of years. There's a lot of acres burned. But, you know, if you look at the longer term records, we're not too far off where we used to be. And these are data that have been corrected for any kind of duplication in the older U.S. Forest Service records. People had kind of written these off because they were saying they weren't as accurate. I'm not saying they're perfectly accurate, but I'm saying they're definitely not off by a factor of 2 or anything close to that. We used to see quite a bit of fire in the Western U.S. The Western U.S. really likes to burn. I seem to be getting red marks coming on my PowerPoint slide here. If we look further back, it's even a little bit more surprising. So these are data that are compiled for kind of the natural background rates of wildfire in the Western U.S., just these Western states. If you're looking at burn scars, or if you're looking at minimum and maximum return intervals for how different forests burn. And we're nowhere close to what these expected natural rates would be.
Down.
You gotta, thank you. Yeah. So, this has really influenced the way that we have developed in the Western U.S., and I think it has a lot of implications for how we should move forward from here. So, starting in the 20s and through the 40s, we had a great marketing campaign. Smokey did a lot of work. We developed a lot of really powerful tools to put out fires. They're great at fire suppression. And that's why you see this really profound decline in area burned, at least. And we were able to maintain that for several decades. We had really low, about 500,000 acres burned per year in the Western U.S. And that was great. During that time, we started to get confidence that we had controlled fire. That's when we started building our reservoirs. So this is a plot showing cumulative reservoir storage throughout the Western U.S. over time. And you can see how quickly that has risen as soon as we started to develop confidence that we could control fire in the Western U.S. We see that also in the Colorado River suspended sediment concentrations declining over time as wildfires decreasing, and also as we're starting to trap a lot more of that sediment in the reservoirs. We also see that in the population. There's an inflection point in population growth in the Western U.S. Around 1950, when we had high confidence that we could control fire, we can get the water stored so we can use it all year long. This was all going great. And so then we ended up building millions of houses in the WUI, the wildland urban interface. This is a plot just showing these 3 data points since 1990 of population of people that live right at that wildland urban interface. Right now, we've got around 22, 23 million people living in that wildland urban interface. And that maybe made more sense when we were working under the assumption that we could control fire perpetually. But at this point, this is costs of fire suppression in the green bar there. Those have gone up dramatically. A lot of that has gone to protecting these houses that we've built in places that are especially vulnerable. So, we've seen a very profound pattern here. It's strongly influenced the way that we've developed in Western U.S. I don't want anybody leaving this thinking that, well, this is just a natural wildfire cycle. But the reason that wildfire is going up is not because we're not putting as much effort towards it. Clearly that the fire suppression costs are going up. We're throwing more than we ever have at it. It's because in a lot of cases, we're recognizing that these fires are uncontrollable upon ignition. Many of the forests are overgrown, have some excessive fuels, and they're as dry as they have been for probably thousands of years. So it's not that we're not trying, it's just that we have a lot more work that needs to be done. At this point, we've got much bigger and less controllable wildfires. And that's really the issue that I want to discuss the implications of and how to move forward from here. I think kind of a reframing of this starts with recognizing that fire has been around literally as long as oxygen, 420 million years. As soon as we had heat, an ignition source, and oxygen, you start getting fires, right? If any of you have not seen Paul Hesburgh's TED Talk, he does a fabulous job talking through natural wildfire regimes and what has happened to them. And he came up with this quote, as far as I know: how do we want our fire? How do we want our smoke? Fire is inevitable here. I think those are really important questions for us to continue to answer. So fire is inevitable. I think the real question we should be asking is, how can we improve fire outcomes? And part of that is going to be helping people understand what the liabilities are, what the risks are, and what the different approaches are to do things differently. So I won't go into much detail about this, and many of you are wildfire and forest experts. You're well aware that we have very different fire regimes throughout the Western U.S., and many of these are kind of out of whack right now. So it's a matter of fixing that problem. Let me move on to talk a bit about effects of wildfire on hill slope, streams, and water resources. I think often we're looking at these things as individual pieces, but when we really start looking at the whole, I think we get a better sense for how we need to move forward. A lot of the pressures that happen when wildfires occur, are increased net precipitation, increased runoff, increased erosion and nutrient and contaminants getting into the streams, increased light coming into the streams. That systematically shifts the state of habitat in the streams in terms of turbidity, in terms of nutrients, sometimes in terms of heavy metals and eutrophication, temperature. It's fundamentally shifting a lot of the ecosystem quality. And then it also has a lot of other impacts on human health, infrastructure, recreation, things like that. So let's talk a little bit about fish. Fish are pretty simple creatures. They don't ask for much, right? Particularly if we're talking about salmonids, trout in the West is what we do a lot of work here in Watershed Sciences on. They want cool water. They want places to hide. They want some velocity or drought refugia, some pools where they can go and hang out, not expend so much energy. And then when they are hungry, they can jet out into the faster flowing water, get some food, and then go back into the slower flowing stuff. They really don't ask for much. And of course, wildfires create very difficult conditions for fish. This is a video showing a debris flow, which are very common after wildfires. And you can imagine, if you're a fish in that river, you don't stand much of a chance, right? Some of these boulders coming down are large SUV truck-sized boulders coming down at the beginning of this debris flow. And certainly the conditions in the stream are not survivable under conditions like this. But fish have evolved to deal with these, right? Debris flows are quite natural features in the landscape. Debris flows and other sediment transport events can leave huge deposits of sediment for sometimes decades or longer. This is a stream channel that's now buried about 1.5 meters deep in gravel. And so the channel up and downstream from there is completely disconnected for fish. But we've actually made the situation a lot more difficult for fish because one of their main adaptation strategies was if some place gets burned up and blown out, they just go somewhere else and they come back and recolonize that stream channel when they can. We've really prevented them from being able to do that by putting in tens of thousands of diversion structures and other dams and barriers in our river networks all throughout the Western U.S. This is just the Weber River watershed here. You can see the hundreds of road crossings, impoundments, and diversions all throughout this watershed. This is just outside of Ogden, Utah, or Salt Lake City's right down here. We've got a lot of work to be eliminating barriers because that's going to help the fish be a lot more adaptable to these conditions. I also want to point out that wildfires also create some of the best fish habitat in the Western U.S. And I think this is a point that's often underappreciated. This is an image from the Tusher Mountains in south central Utah where the Twitchell Canyon fire was. This is part of that lower part of that canyon there. Lots of debris flow sediment came through here, but it's a great fish habitat despite all the sediment loading after the wildfire. And all these big boulders that create all these great cascade and step pool environments, those came down in previous wildfires, after previous wildfires from debris flow. That's where most of that really coarse grained sediment has come from. And so I think we shouldn't be underestimating the value of wildfires in kind of rejuvenating habitat. Here's a river that's rebuilding. This is the Dollar Ridge Fire near Duchesne, Utah. You look at this and you might say it's a mess. It's a beautiful mess. This river is kind of rebuilding itself, recreating side channel habitat, doing all kinds of great things that the river wants to do and that the fish will really appreciate. It looks messy to us, but it's actually a really important way by which the river is rejuvenating itself. So, finding ways to help the river do the work it needs to do to create good habitat is a big part of what we're focusing on here at Utah State University. We've got an emphasis on what we call low-tech process-based restoration of riverscapes. And this is really all about not bringing out the big Tonka trucks and moving a bunch of huge boulders around to create some river in our own vision. It's not going to change over time. It's really about giving the river the resources it needs to create its own habitat. And we can often do this at a very small fraction of the cost of these more traditional river restoration projects that are just not viable over long 10, 50, 100 kilometer reaches of rivers. You just can't take those hardscaping approaches. We've got a couple of models and a nice conceptual paper that was published maybe by a couple folks on this call here even about the resilience of terrestrial and aquatic fauna to wildfire regimes and how to move forward and model how habitat might change after a wildfire and how populations of fish might respond to that. So I'm happy to talk more about that in a bit. Let's switch topic a little bit and talk about reservoirs, because this is another big concern, especially as we have so many reservoirs that are so low right now in the Western U.S. What are the impacts of wildfires on reservoirs? Well, here's one example. Estrancha Springs Reservoir in Colorado had two large fires in its watershed in 1996 and 2002. And water storage loss was considerably higher than was initially expected. Denver ended up spending about $30 million dredging out the sediment from these wildfires. It's pretty expensive. In addition to that, wildfires are bringing down all these ash plumes. Water quality gets really nasty. Often the water is not usable for weeks or months at a time. So big costs associated with there. And there's lots of other examples of this. From the Detroit Lake in Oregon last year, there was a Detroit Lake fire that took the reservoir offline for several weeks. There are several reservoirs just outside of Los Angeles that were impacted heavily by the 2009 station fire. So Los Angeles is now spending $150 to $190 million to dredge those reservoirs. It's a big cost. We are currently undergoing a systematic analysis of all 137 reservoirs throughout Utah. And we now have an infrastructure that can be replicated in other areas or other states. This is a map showing all 137 large reservoirs throughout the state and their watersheds depicted in white there. This plot on the right is showing reservoir built capacity over time in blue. That's how much storage volume we had built over the last 150 years. The red is showing an estimation of how much storage we have lost, or rather, how much we still have. The difference between the blue and red lines is how much we've lost. And this was from a report from Division of Water Resources in Utah, just projecting out. If we don't build any more dams, they're projecting, with a 0.2% sedimentation rate, this is how we would lose reservoir storage capacity over time. Interestingly, in 2010, the word wildfire did not show up in this report. They were not considering at all the impacts of wildfires on our reservoir capacity at that time. We'd only had a couple of large wildfires, but we've had quite a few more since then. And so we're asking the question now, how much more quickly is sedimentation going to increase and built reservoir capacity going to decrease with the increase in wildfire that we're expecting. Surprisingly, we didn't have very many of our reservoirs mapped. Only 18 of the 137 had been mapped such that you could calculate sedimentation rates. So we're starting an effort now working with Aggie Air from the Utah Water Research Lab, mapping these with a structure for motion with drones and sonar in the reservoirs themselves. And we're comparing those to as-built surveys to figure out basically how wildfire has changed reservoir sedimentation in various places across the state. And we've only finished the analysis for about 6 of those dozen that we mapped last year. But just to give you a ballpark, we're looking at somewhere around the sedimentation rates doubling in the reservoirs. So they've gone up considerably. I'll talk real briefly about the new modeling framework that my research group has developed to apply to this problem, to predict, if a wildfire were to occur in any of those 137 watershed reservoirs, where would the most erosion be likely to occur? How much of that sediment is likely to get down into the reservoir itself? And so we've built 3 different modeling components, and we've stitched them together into a pretty fully automated system here that models post-fire erosion, debris flows, as well as hillslope runoff and erosion, and then actually transports that sediment downstream. So we know how much is actually delivered to different points in the river downstream. There's a paper we had in 2019 that basically lays out this framework, but we've now fully automated it, and we're happy to make that available to folks. The first part of this is doing a really meaningful delineation of the basin so that we can do all the calculations about where post-wildfire debris flows are likely to occur. And so this is done with the tool we call usual watershed delineations toolbox. With the standard toolbox, when you bring things like reservoirs into your watershed, you get all kinds of funky artifacts happening as part of the delineation process. And we've done things to modify that so that basically if there are hill slopes that drain to a reservoir, we're just routing sediment down the hill slope and to that reservoir rather than trying to do calculations across what are obviously artificially low slopes here. This usual watershed delineation tool also does a lot of things in terms of breaking up the watershed into a bunch of subcatchments and things like that. So it'll enable you to do lots of different calculations from that point. We have basically taken the standard USGS debris flow hazard model and we've completely recoded it and made it open source now. So this is the standard model that USGS uses to predict debris flow hazards after a wildfire as a function of rainfall intensity and the DNVR, the soil K factor, and area burned at slopes above 23 degrees. So we're running that within this model framework to predict the probability of debris flows occurring. And then we're using a model to predict how large those debris flows are likely to be. And again, this is the same thing that the USGS is doing for their standard debris flow model. We're taking that one step further, though, and predicting how much of that sediment actually gets into the stream. And to do this, we developed a simple geometric model, basically to figure out, depending on how big the valley bottom is, if you have a very big valley bottom and a small fan, it's possible that none of that debris fan will get into the river. And so no sediment would be contributed to the river in this case. As your debris fan encroaches on the river, you get increasingly larger amounts of sediment going into the river. And so we've done at least the geometric approach to predicting sediment delivery. Once we've run all the debris flow predictions, we can now model hill slope erosion in places that didn't have debris flows. Even if you didn't have debris flows, you might get sheet wash or rilling erosion. We're using the Russell equation for that. Once you've got all of that, you need to be able to route sediment downstream to figure out how far downstream it's going to go. Are there bottlenecks where sediment's going to start building up? And that might be impacting fish habitat, for example. Or you might be interested in predicting how much is going to make it all the way downstream to some reservoir. And so to do that, we've teamed up with John Chuba from Virginia Tech, who developed a Lagrangian model. That's basically a particle tracking model that uses mixed grain size transports. It's predicting movement of sand and gravel, and the two of those interact with each other during transport. And so We can predict how much of each of those grain sizes, up to 9 different grain sizes, is moving downstream. And it runs with unsteady flow. So this is a plot on the left here showing a bunch of packets of sediment that have come down after a wildfire. This is the Twitchell Canyon fire. They get dumped into the channel. That's where we start. And then we're routing this hydrograph through that stream network. And we're scaling it from the mouth of the basin all the way up to the headwaters of different flows. But what you're seeing here is as the flows go up, you can see the different points in time where sediment's being transported downstream. You can see places where those sediment packages build up over time. And you can see how many are getting out to the basin outlet as well. A lot more I could talk about here, but I just wanted to give you at least a sense for how we're attacking this problem and what our modeling capabilities are. Just about 10 more minutes. I'm running on time. I want to just take a little bit of a step back and think about these things in the context of the broader issue of climate change. Climate change has big implications for the Western U.S., obviously. Last year was a very severe drought. We were looking good in the end of December here, at least in Utah. And then it didn't snow for the last month and a half. And so we're actually well below average conditions for this time of year again. The longer term forecasts are that we're going to see a lot more drought. We're going to see less snowpack. We're going to see a lot more dust, which has a feedback to snow melt and less snowpack staying on the hill slopes. We are expecting to see more wildfire. We're expecting to see more heat stress. The dust that we're seeing because of things like the Great Salt Lake being so much lower than it normally is, there's a lot of heavy metals and contaminants in that dust. It's pretty nasty stuff. At the same time, we're also seeing some floods. The atmosphere is holding a lot more water, and when that water decides to come down all in one big dump, this was last year, August 1st, in the middle of an exceptional drought. All of a sudden, Salt Lake City was flooding. We had people kayaking in the streets. We've done some pretty funky things to our climate system, and it responds in unexpected ways sometimes. The longer term historic trend is very clear. This is change in snowpack throughout the Western U.S. From 1995 to 2020. You see a lot of big red circles there. The red meaning the snowpack has declined over that time, and the size of the circle being scaled to the amount of decrease that we're seeing. In the future, I just finished a paper looking at future forecasts and implications for ski resorts in Utah. And it's not good under any future climate scenario, but how bad it gets is still up to us. The quicker we get the fossil fuels turned off, the quicker we solve this problem. So again, how do we want our fire? How do we want our smoke? It's continuing down the same road. Last plot in this section, I think a lot of people look around and they see solar panels, they see wind farms going up, and they're like, well, we've got this problem solved. We're moving in the right direction. We are not moving in the right direction. This is a plot of global energy consumption. It's showing how coal, oil, and gas have all increased so dramatically over the last couple of decades. All global renewables are represented in that thin little green band, all of them. So renewables have not offset fossil fuels in any way, shape, or form. They've just enabled growth in the energy sector. If you feel like we are starting to turn the corner on this plot, I hope, convinces you otherwise. We have a lot more work to do. The situation is a lot more urgent than we have been giving it credit for. We're not only going in the wrong direction, we're accelerating in the wrong direction here still, and we need to change that. And I think everybody on this call has a role to play in helping us turn that around. Okay, that's the low point in the talk, I promise, in terms of morale. Let's turn it around here a bit and talk about next steps, things that we can be doing at the individual state and national scale to turn this around. I hope, given my last statement there, at the individual scale, everyone realizes that we need to be voting to eliminate fossil fuels. And we need to be talking with those elected officials about getting real actions to eliminate fossil fuels as quickly as possible. More broadly, we all need to be talking with friends and family and acquaintances. We need to normalize talking about climate change and talking about these related issues that we're concerned about, these wildfire related issues, these air quality, these water quality, these fish related issues. Helping them understand our common values and helping them understand that this is a key part of getting this problem solved, getting all these integrally related problems solved. And I think on an individual scale, many of us can be doing more to develop smarter and manage our personal wildfire risks as well. There's lots of resources coming out for that. I'll just put in a plug for USU Forestry Extension. It's got some great recommendations and resources along those lines. At the state and national scale, again, we need to eliminate fossil fuels as quickly as possible. For all the talk in Washington, we have not moved meaningfully in that direction in the last year. Will we? I don't know. I'm not holding out a lot of hope, but we'll see. At the scale of Utah, our state legislature developed a Utah roadmap. They had somebody at the University of Utah develop a roadmap for how we get to carbon neutral. And in the last 3 years since funding that, the legislature has done nothing to get us on that path. But things like carbon pricing, increasing renewables, developing carbon-free transportation, these are all things we need to be doing to fix these underlying problems that we're seeing. We need to invest more in proactive forest management. Proactive fuel reductions, that's going to require prescribed burns, kind of what's underlying Paul Hesberg's comment about how do we want our fire, how do we want our smoke. This has to be a more common practice. And there's a lot of public pushback because anytime they see fire, they think, well, do we really need to be doing this prescribed burn now? I don't want to be breathing that stuff. It's not a matter of if we're going to be breathing that stuff, it's a matter of when and how much. And prescribed burns tend to be much better air quality conditions than wildfires that go out of control. In places, we can certainly be doing more aggressive thinning. We can certainly be doing a lot more aspen restoration and beaver restoration. These are some of these low-tech process-based restoration approaches that I talked about earlier. And we need to continue to build partnerships to work efficiently on bold, comprehensive watershed management. So I'll just give you a couple of examples here, and then I'll be done. This is that same data that I showed you in one of my initial plots. It's a squiggly green line showing how wildfire suppression costs have gone up over time. This is just a small fraction of the cost that we pay, right? For just the campfire alone, had an additional $10 billion in insurance claims beyond the $3+ billion in suppression costs for all the fires that year. But then there's all these other costs, premature mortality, healthcare utilization, lost productivity, impacts on quality of life, compromised stream, river, and drinking water quality, loss of endemic and threatened species, damage to critical infrastructure. Some of these things have dollar signs associated with them. Some of them don't, but they're real costs. When we start adding up all of those costs, it's very concerning that our investment in fuel treatments and other mitigation, is down here. We're talking about somewhere on the order of $500 million per year. We are not investing nearly enough in preventative treatments. We need to flip that script, recognize the costs of letting wildfires get out of control, and start putting in a lot more investment in more proactively managing our fire. Some of that's going to be fighting fire with fire, restoring aspen and mixed severity forests where that makes sense, and letting beaver do what they do best. This is showing how beaver wet up this valley bottom corridor, and yes, there's going to be a lot of sediment that's still going to come off these burned hill slopes. But this type of a valley bottom, this type of riverscape here, has a lot more resilience to it. And so this is a pretty cheap way to get back a lot of resilience in your landscape. Last big suggestion here, I'll just point out Utah has been very proactive on our shared stewardship program. One of the things I love about this program is it's really focused on people and collaborations, making connections and relationships, and making sure that we're talking together, we're moving forward together to do smarter forest and fire management. And we can bring other water resource and fish management folks into the mix with these types of frameworks. I would say we've been putting pilot project amounts of money towards this so far. We should be putting much more towards these types of efforts. They're already showing great value in terms of return on investment. So just a couple of points in summary. I hope I've convinced you that there is no fireless future in the Western U.S. And I think we have to, many people on this call have a responsibility to help the public understand that better. Wildfire isn't bad. It's something that we need to manage. And if managed well, we can minimize damage to society, and we can even enhance ecosystems. Wildfires can do some very good things in terms of regenerating ecosystems. We can choose when, where, and how we get our fire and smoke by doing a lot more prescribed burns and more proactive treatments, or we can just keep rolling the dice. If we're going to continue down this road of fire suppression, we're essentially just rolling the dice, and we see when fires pop up, where do they do, and whether they're controllable or not. I much prefer to be more proactive and start choosing the time, place, and situation of where we're getting our fire and smoke. I think we have to step back and acknowledge that we have built millions of homes and thousands of reservoirs under a false sense of security that we could control fire, and we cannot. And that's going to be even more difficult in the future, regardless of how much further down this road of climate change we go. We can look at that and understand the mistake that we have made. But I think more importantly, we need to look forward. We need to be taking care of people and ecosystems. There are millions of people in that wildland-urban interface. There's no regulation saying that they have to be covered by insurance companies. So while insurance companies are regulated in the amount they can increase premiums, they don't have to offer coverage. And we're seeing people already losing their coverage at the end of their term. And that's not fair. It's not a good way to handle this broader problem. At the very least, let's stop digging ourselves deeper. Start developing in smarter ways. In terms of fish, I think at the biggest scale, acknowledging that wildfire and fragmentation are really what pose the biggest problems for fish populations. We need more good wildfire. It's bringing some more of those sediment and tools into the river, and we need less fragmentation so that fish are able to respond more dynamically, and the river is able to rebuild its own habitat in a way that it knows really well how to do it. Last point I'll make here is we've got to get those fossil fuels turned off. With all the other great work that's going on by many of you on this call and so many others, it's all great. But if we don't get the fossil fuels turned off, it is just making our lives more and more difficult down the road. So I hope I brought your focus a little bit more on that issue and seeing how, help you see how it relates to, it really underlies all the other things that we care about here. So with that, I am done. I would love to hear from you. You can go to pollev.com, Patrick Belmont 912, and you can put in some information into this and it'll pop up on my screen here. So it's totally anonymous. You can put in whatever you want there. And then once there are some selections up there, you can vote things up and down. Having said all of that, I'd be happy to kind of turn it over to Liz or anybody else that wants to ask questions. We can have more of a discussion.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, as we're waiting for people to, we'll keep the screen up. So as people feel compelled to write their answers, that'll show up. Just, if anyone has any questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask or type it in the chat. To kick us off, I'll ask a question. Patrick, could you talk a little bit more just about those low-tech restoration methods that you've been working on?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something we've had great success with here at Utah State. Joe Wheaton really has been one of the pioneers in this. And the idea is that we're recognizing that we have tens of thousands of river miles, stream miles that need to be restored. We have degraded the habitat somehow, and we need to restore them. And the conventional approaches, where you get the big Tonka trucks out, start moving big boulders around, it's just prohibitively expensive. An example was for Bridge Creek in north central Oregon. BLM wanted to restore Bridge Creek, about 10-kilometer reach of it. They got an estimate from Dave Roskin, who's one of the leaders in stream restoration. And with his techniques, it was going to cost about $2 million to restore that 10-kilometer reach. Joe Wheaton and a few others here at USU went in and spent $13,000 and built a bunch of beaver analog structures. The beaver came back in droves and started creating all this additional habitat. And so then they had, a little bit more money to just monitor, and they could see the progress and the habitat that was created. We're often talking, a few percent of the cost of these traditional approaches to help the river just build the more messy ecosystem that it really likes. It creates all those different habitat niches. So we've got some workshops here at USU that we welcome you to participate in. If you look at USU Restoration Consortium, those will be advertised there. Joe Wheaton really heads a lot of that. And we just hired a new Restoration Consortium director here, Dominique Shore. She'll be joining us in April. And so you'll be hearing a lot more about those workshops in the future. So, okay, we're starting to get some suggestions here. We're rolling in. I love it. Thanks.
Patrick, we also have another question in the chat from Daniel Patterson. Are goats being used to graze for defensible space on private lands in Utah?
Great question. I mean, that would be, one of those kind of low-tech restoration processes. I don't know the extent to which people are using goats, but that's along those lines of if we can use simple approaches to keep these ecosystems a little bit more in balance, it's usually a good thing. Yeah, but unfortunately, I can't tell you the extent to which that's happening in Utah.
Well, that seems like the questions that are coming in, but Patrick, do you want to touch on some of these responses that are coming in from your poll?
Yeah. So I'm curious if you guys can vote on them. And I haven't used this version of Poll Everywhere before. I use this in class all the time, and students can put in information and whatnot. We do surveys, but the top one right now is politics, and certainly that is a big control on this. And it's kind of concerning to see the lack of conversation that's going on in some of our political circles about the science and about what we need to do to move forward. What I would say is many of us have taken our eye off of our responsibility to inform the decision making. And so I think leaving politicians to do what politicians want to do is probably a mistake. And that we should, as scientists, as natural resource managers, be a little bit more proactive in those conversations. I'm going to Logan City Council meeting tonight to make a public comment on Logan's considering a 15-year contract to buy more coal power. We should not be considering that in 2022. But I've taken it on myself, and a lot of our faculty have really recognized the value of not just publishing papers. We have to do that as academics, but that can't be what it's all about. We really need to be getting information to the decision makers and making sure they understand it, and making sure ultimately that they're being held accountable for the decisions they make. They're either consistent or inconsistent with the science. I think we need to be quite a bit bolder in that respect.
Patrick, I've got another question that just came in. Do you have any thoughts on applying the low-tech river restoration to wildfire/BAER emergency response? How do we get this more effective and less expensive process integrated into the federal agencies post-wildfire response?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the low-tech approaches are making their way there. Utah state agencies have really glommed onto them, and they're excited about them. I'm working with UDOT, our Department of Transportation here now. We're just starting conversations about, after a wildfire, how can UDOT start to identify where their risk factors are? They can use our model for that. And then what can they do about it? And UDOT, of course, loves to go and just throw huge boulders at things and stabilize things. That's been their approach. But we're starting to help them see that there are lighter touches that are actually more effective in the long run. I'm not saying that we should never use those really, hardscape approaches, but in a lot of cases, they're less effective and they're a lot more expensive. We can't do them in nearly the places. So I think better predictive capabilities, which are our new modeling framework, I think helps us understand places that are most likely to experience catastrophic erosion. That helps us pinpoint those places, prioritize them, and then whether we're using low-tech approaches or if other approaches are needed, we're going to be in a better shape prioritizing where to do what. Yeah, lots of other great things coming in here, and I can see these reorganizing now, which is cool. Lack of understanding the historical potential. The West loves to burn, and I think that's been underappreciated in the past. The present is not a good baseline. Certainly, overgrazing is an issue. Moving around of invasive species, cheatgrass is continuing to be an issue in a lot of places. And now these fire suppression practices, we keep defaulting to that. And I think part of the solution here is, I don't know if we have any folks who are managing fires, who would be incident management teams, but you can put yourself in the place of those people who have to make those calls. Do we let this burn or do we put it out? We've been putting so much emphasis on people minimizing the immediate risk that a lot of them are concerned about letting it burn, not just putting it out right away. I think we probably need to be creating some policies that allow those decision makers on the ground some space to say, I recognize that there are risks to water or to infrastructure. I recognize there's a risk that this could get out of control. But there's also a risk on the other side of not letting this burn and then continuing to let our fuels build up in excess. And giving them a little bit more space on that, taking a little bit of the weight off their shoulders, I think is probably an important part of the solution here.
If anyone else has any additional questions, like I said, you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself or pop them in the chat. It's really interesting to see kind of this distribution of barriers that people are passionate about.
Yeah, certainly funding is another big one. And just like I was saying earlier, I mean, I think we have really underestimated the costs associated with these uncontrollable wildfires. Even after we've been looking at the suppression costs, saying, wow, that's so much. You add on top of that all of the insurance claims and things like that, and then all those other costs. We've been greatly understating that. And once we start to help people understand that, I think it becomes a lot easier to flip our investment to being more proactive. But I think probably a lot of us on this call here have a role to play in getting that understanding out there in the public.
Yeah, it really seems people are very concerned about overgrazing in this call right now. So
yeah, and I would love to know more about that from folks. So I'm happy to talk with any of you if you want to follow up with me via email. I'd love to get better in touch with some of your perspective and some of the things that you're trying to do and how any of this meshes with that.
Okay, well, if we don't have any other questions, Patrick, was there anything that you wanted to touch on before we go? Or I feel like you really gave us a lot to think about.
Great. Yeah, no, I really appreciate everyone calling in. I'm sure you all are working very hard on these issues as it is. I hope this has given you a little bit of maybe some new perspective, some things to focus on moving forward. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to chat or if you are interested more in learning more about resources we've got available here at USU. I'm happy to chat more. So.
We do have one more question that just came in. What are the immediate controls for erosion that the fall after a major wildfire?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different approaches that you can take there in terms of getting hydro mulch on the hill slope, getting hay, things like that. But they're fairly costly, and so I think prioritizing where we really want to put those is essential. And so this tool that we've developed will help with some of that prioritization. But we're not going to be able to do that everywhere. And I think acknowledging that we're going to get large sediment loads after wildfires is important. And so reducing the fragmentation and being more proactive, especially in places that are directly connected from a sediment standpoint to things that we really care about downstream, whether it's fish habitat or reservoirs or whatever, I think is really the key to turning that around and being a bit more proactive in those management.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Patrick. This was really informative, and you've given us a lot to think about. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you guys are interested in sharing this webinar with any of your colleagues or revisiting it at a later date, it will be available on the Frames platform, and you can go to the Southwest Fire Consortium website in order to find that. But thank you, Patrick. Great presentation, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Take care.